Hello, this presentation is going to finalize our Chapter 8 discussion, which is just concluding how a postsynaptic cell responds to different types of neurotransmitters. And that's what we're going to discuss here in this video, is just talk about some primary neurotransmitters that are common in the central and the peripheral nervous system, and briefly compare the different types of receptors which these neurotransmitters bind to. So to recall what we discussed in class on Monday, we noted in the far left that acetylcholine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine are neurotransmitters that we'll see during the rest of the semester. We're going to use them in the peripheral nervous system. And then on the list on the right, we have some common central nervous system neurotransmitters, which include dopamine, serotonin, histamine, and glutamate. And you may recall from class on Monday that I have the ellipsis down there following glutamate because this is certainly not an all-inclusive list, and chemicals that aren't classically considered to be neurotransmitters actually have neurotransmitter activity in the brain. But we're going to focus predominantly on acetylcholine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. I also showed this video on Monday to help visually give some illustration of the different types of neurotransmitters, what they look like, and whether or not a neurotransmitter just simply opens or closes a particular ion channel, or whether or not a neurotransmitter can open activate a second messenger system. Okay, so if you see on there, for example, dopamine has a dash under the channels section, so it tells us that dopamine only activates second messenger systems. Contrasting that to glycine, it does not activate second messenger systems, but it does open chloride ion channels, and you can see that it has an inhibitory effect by letting chloride ion flow in. Okay, so that's how we're going to read this table. We already talked about acetylcholine, but I'd like to go ahead and review it because we did conclude class with this on Monday, and it is found not only in the peripheral nervous system but also in the central nervous system. And the second item here is that we'll see its primary role at the skeletal muscle when we get into the third unit on how the somatic nervous system regulates skeletal muscle contraction. But the proper name for a receptor that binds to acetylcholine is called a cholinergic receptor. And what we concluded with on Monday is there's actually two types of acetylcholine, or you could say cholinergic receptors. One class acts as a sodium-potassium channel, and those are called nicotinic receptors. And then conversely, other tissues have what are called muscarinic receptors, and those are the receptors that activate second messenger systems. The nicotinic receptors we'll find noted, it says motor end plate. That's just the part of the skeletal muscle where these nicotinic receptors are located. So again, we'll better illustrate that in chapter 12 in unit 3. As well, the second bullet, something called ganglion neurons of both the sympathetic and parasympathetic subdivisions. I'm going to hold you off again a little bit until we get into chapter 11, looking at how the autonomic nervous system functions, but we'll find them at these ganglion in the autonomic nervous system, as well as in the adrenal medulla. Okay, so if we look at the nicotinic receptors, if you remember from the previous image, because it is just a sodium-potassium channel, when acetylcholine binds to it, sodium will flood into the cell, causing always depolarization, and therefore the nicotinic receptors are considered to be always stimulatory. And I do believe we showed this image in class on Monday, just a simple illustration of a chemically gated sodium channel is how these nicotinic receptors work. Okay. We noted in the far left, the acetylcholine is absent, the gate's closed, and on the far right, acetylcholine is present, and then it allows for the flux of sodium into the cell. And a very similar yet alternative image can be found in your textbook in figure 8.11a. If we contrast that to the muscarinic receptor, as we noted a moment ago, The muscarinic receptors are those that activate a second messenger system, or summarized here as this 7-helix type of receptor. And because it does activate a second messenger system, we know that the effect within all cell types is not the same. So depending on the cell type, acetylcholine may be excitatory at a tissue, or it actually may have an inhibitory effect at a particular tissue. It just depends on the receptor, on the tissue, and what that tissue is designed to do. In this image we have an example of a target tissue where acetylcholine binds to a muscarinic receptor. We can kind of see the cascading effect. And then if you look on the far right side of the image, you can see the potassium channels actually opened, and so that actually causes hyperpolarization in the cell, and thusly would call this an inhibitory effect. A similar image can be found in figure 811b in your textbook. So that's acetylcholine. And other neurotransmitters that we'll study include serotonin, which comes from an amino acid called tryptophan. You may have heard of that before. And then other neurotransmitters, which collectively are called catecholamines, okay, which is just a group of neurotransmitters that get their origins from a molecule called, or amino acid called, tyrosine. Our catecholamines include epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And all of our monoamine neurotransmitters, serotonin and all the catecholamines, usually are going to be taken back into the presynaptic nerve in the axon terminal like we described on Monday, and or they may be catabolized or broken down by these things called monoamine oxidase. Which, if you work through that word backwards, the suffix ase, you recall, the suffix ase tells us this is an enzyme, and it oxidizes, removes electrons, or you could say breaks down. So it's an enzyme that breaks down these monoamine, these single amino acid built molecules. Okay. And that may not sound familiar to you. Monoamine oxidase may not sound familiar to you, but you may have heard of these things called MAOIs. If you watch any media, you've probably seen the ads for MAOIs or antidepressant pills. And so monoamine oxidase is an enzyme that naturally breaks down these molecules. And then so if someone is prescribed a MAOI, the inhibitor inhibits the breakdown of the neurotransmitter, and then thusly the neurotransmitter can stay in the synapse longer and have a prolonged effect. So our monoamine neurotransmitters, they will activate G proteins, which basically implies a second messenger system. And so we get a whole bunch of variation when we see the presence of a monoamine neurotransmitter doing its work. So it's going to, on a large scale, open or close ion channels at some target tissue. If we look at serotonin, its neurotransmitter receptor doesn't have a very tricky name. It's just called the serotonin receptor. See it over here. And you've probably heard of serotonin before, and it's an emotional type associated neurotransmitter. And if you look at some pharmaceuticals that you may have heard of before, maybe heard of SSRIs, or serotonin specific reuptake inhibitors, these are the exact pharmaceuticals that have antidepressant effects by preventing the reuptake of serotonin and allowing it to remain in the synaptic cleft and prolong the effects of the neurotransmitter serotonin. And so this one's just really specific to serotonin itself. Okay, so serotonin, central nervous system neurotransmitter, and the serotonin receptor itself does activate a second messenger system. If we look at another neurotransmitter in the central nervous system called dopamine, dopamine is a widespread or widely used neurotransmitter in the brain, and we have two primary systems in our brain that utilize dopamine, And one is called the nigrostriatal dopamine system, and the other is called the mesolimbic dopamine system. And the nigrostriatal system is involved with regulating our physical movement, or what's described here as our motor control. And then the mesolimbic system is probably what you're more familiar with if you think about dopamine and emotional responses, and that's through what's called the mesolimbic dopamine system. And what's interesting is when we are exposed to something that we get addicted to, it actually turns on this mesolimbic system in our brain. And using the word addiction, we always maybe necessarily think of negative things like alcoholism or drug abuse or whatever. But even addictions to, like, if you're in love and you're happy when you see your boyfriend or girlfriend or whomever, right? You're activating the dopamine system in your mesolimbic, right, section of the brain. So dopamine is involved with that emotional response. As well as the last bullet on here, the disease called schizophrenia is linked to this mesolimbic system being actually overactive. Okay, so dopamine is also an important central nervous system neurotransmitter, as well as norepinephrine. I'll abbreviate this NE. And generally, if I mention norepinephrine, I'm also implying epinephrine. So I may say norepinephrine and or norepinephrine. They're structurally very similar to one another. And in the peripheral nervous system, it's considered to be a sympathetic neurotransmitter. So you may recall sympathetic means fight or flight. So norepinephrine and epinephrine are sympathetic neurotransmitters. And so they allow for the brain to be awake and all kinds of other activities that we'll see coming up in Chapter 11. Looking at the image on the far right, you'll notice that norepinephrine does not just simply open or close ion channels. It does also activate second messenger systems, as mentioned earlier. The terminology for the norepinephrine receptors, they're called adrenergic receptors, which may seem kind of off the wall at first. However, if you think about the name of norepinephrine when it's in the blood or a hormone, it's called noradrenaline, or maybe you've heard of adrenaline. When you think about the word adrenaline, then you can think of the word adrenergic. The words originate similar to one another. Norepinephrine is noradrenaline. The difference is whether the neurotransmitter is in a synapse or in the blood. So the proper term is called adrenergic. And there are actually two subtypes of adrenergic receptors. Some are called alpha adrenergic, and others are called beta adrenergic receptors. And within them, there's additional types of adrenergic receptors. Like there's alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, and I think there's a beta 3 as well. And because there's so many different types of adrenergic receptors, they don't all work exactly the same. And so notice I have the words generally italicized here, and that's for a reason. Generally, when norepinephrine binds to alpha adrenergic receptors, the effect is stimulatory at the target tissue. And conversely, typically when norepinephrine binds to beta adrenergic receptors, the effect is usually inhibitory at the target tissue. A very important notable exception is norepinephrine, when it binds to the beta adrenergic receptors at the SA node area of the heart, instead of inhibiting the heart, it actually stimulates the heart. So norepinephrine at the heart causes it to speed up, which makes sense, right? You've heard of adrenaline or something like that, you know, your heart rate goes up. The reason it goes up is because norepinephrine and epinephrine bind to the beta adrenergic receptors. Okay. And so another image from the CNS forum illustrating in the green the adrenergic receptor. This looks like it's an alpha adrenergic receptor. We can see a G protein pathway. If you look on the far end of the image, you can see that the influx of sodium and then no effect on the potassium channels. And so this effect at this target tissue must be excitatory. Okay. And another image just illustrating the G protein can also, or is activated in this pathway. Other neurotransmitters that are amino acid based include two excitatory neurotransmitters, including glutamate and aspartate. These are in the central nervous system. Glycine and GABA, or gamma aminobutyric acid. These two are inhibitory in the central nervous system. And besides this point right here, we want to address these neurotransmitters at all the rest of the semester. And this will conclude our Chapter 8 discussion. Look for a Chapter 9 video in the near future as well. Thank you.